Welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. We've got stuff to talk about today, what I gave, the title I gave this episode is Why History Matters. I may even have done an episode out of the 117, so there have been 116 other episodes, and I believe one of them might have had the same title. But this time I have a very specific meaning for it that has something to do with Supreme Court decisions. But before I move in that particular direction, I want to turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who is going to tell us a little bit about the rules of the game.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans. I am the Director of Education Outreach at New American History, and I've been collaborating with NCHE this summer to be with Joanne. Today, I am not at home. Some people ask where the orange wall was, Joanne. I'm working with teachers all week on curriculum, so I'm actually borrowing this nice little tiny room that they usually have students go in to record podcasts and their own little videos. It's a really cool space that we're working in, but there aren't any students on Friday, so they're letting me steal this room so that as soon as we're done here, I can hop back over and keep working with the teachers. So they were very kind.
Annie, thank you.
Shout out to Albemarle Schools in Virginia.
Thank you.
But we are here today as we gather every Friday, and we want to make sure that everybody knows that you want to continue to add your ideas, your thoughts, your reflections in the chat. But if you have specific questions, as Joanne's talking today, those have to go in the Q&A so that I can find them quickly and we can answer as many. We never get to all of them, but we answer as many as we can. So please kindly put your burning questions in the chat as we are listening this morning. We're ready.
Okay, and if people need to hear it, if you want everyone to see what you're saying in chat, you need to be sure to be addressing all participants or whatever the language is, which I don't remember.
Everyone, not host and panelist. Yep.
Everyone, right, all hosts and panelists, right. Anyway, so to be part of the always active conversation here at History Matters. Okay, so a little bit of a discussion, some of which may be obvious, but as a historian, let's see what happens if I do this. You know, someday, yeah, that's not good. Someday, like, you know, week 177, I'll have really totally mastered using Zoom. At any rate, as I'm speaking as a historian today, so although some of what I will be saying clearly has a political import, my main purpose here, as you'll hear as I'm talking this morning, has to do with history and how it's used and good historical practices and less good historical practices, which obviously is something that came to mind a lot because of recent Supreme Court decisions, which have made very assertive use of history, tradition, claims of things having been true forever throughout American history. I always tell my students, if you're going to say that something is unique, first, or always true, you better really check your tracks, because 99% of the time you're going to be wrong. So anyway, because of all of those Supreme Court decisions, several of which did use history in what I see as a rather sly way, I wanted to talk a little bit about that, about one or two specific examples of what sloppy, deliberately sloppy in promotion of an agenda historical research looks like, and what better historical research looks like. I want to say at the outset here that it's important to note that it's not as though, I've said this so many times about so many things in American history, right? Like there's been no beautiful, pure moment in the past where everything was wonderful, and the founding period was not that moment. There is no golden moment. That same idea holds true in talking about the politicization of history, which is history in one way or another is always or has always been politicized by some people at some time. We see it even in the current day in textbooks, textbook wars about how things are depicted and taught to children. That, you know, you can go back in long, long stretches of time and see those kinds of debates and see those kinds of weird assertions in history textbooks or history classrooms. There are any number of ways in which people try and have tried, I won't say throughout American history because I will contradict myself, for a really long time, to use American history for a particular purpose. And, you know, I always tell my students, my undergraduate students in the research seminars that I teach, in which they all have to produce a 20-page research paper grounded on primary materials from the 18th century. I tell them that if you know what you're looking for, if you already have drawn a conclusion and you look to the past, you look to history to confirm it, you'll be able to. You can cherry pick the past for anything you want it to be. That's not good historical research, right? Good historical research isn't, I need to prove this now because it's what I want to be true. You can do that. You can do it by carefully cherry picking quotes. You can do it by quoting things out of context. You can do it by referring to part of something, but not the full something. There are so many ways in which you can play with the past to promote whatever idea it is that you see the need to promote. That's not good historical research. And what I tell my students is, you need to let the evidence speak to you. Doesn't mean that you start to do research with a totally blank mind, sort of rummaging around, wondering what you're going to see. Of course, when you begin to do historical research, you have thoughts in your mind about what you think you might find, or what you're assuming you might find, or what kinds of questions you want to ask, and what questions you're starting with. But you need to be open-minded when you go to evidence, because whatever you're starting with, the evidence will have something to say to you, and it may be a total surprise. It may be what you don't expect. It may totally contradict what you're assuming. Those are some of the ways in which really insightful new historical observations or insights are learned. It's through people with an open mind asking smart questions and then letting the evidence speak to them. That's good historical research. That's a responsible way of using the past. What has happened in the past? So, for example, one could ask, as I will in a moment, how has abortion been treated in American history in the past? I will now look at that and see what it says. And that will tell me what the tradition of thinking is in the United States on the issue of abortion. I might go into that search and say to myself, I'll bet it's always been a crime. I'll bet. And now let me go look. And lo and behold, I would get a more complicated story. So I have in my notes here that Justice Alito would not get a good grade in my seminar, I am afraid, because, and I'll get to what he says in a minute, but if he drew some of the conclusions in which he does draw in Dobbs, I would ask my student for evidence. I would point out contradictions in historical facts and events that don't add up or don't agree with the broad assertion being made in that person's research paper. And I would ask that student to go back to the evidence and try and get a sense of what people at the time really thought, really did, how they really acted, what you can tell of what they wanted in it, and what they said, to really grapple with the evidence, try to get down on a ground level and get a sense of how this issue or any issue existed at the time. And then look at that evidence, research, weigh it, evaluate it, and then draw a conclusion. That, in one way or another, is what I teach my students in my undergrad seminars. Now, what we've been seeing in the recent past is some very selective reading of US history or non-reading of US history, leading to some pretty major decisions that are claiming that there are long-standing traditions, things that have always been true, that justify some of these rather sweeping and extreme decisions that are being made. Many historians, I am certainly not the only one, that looks at those sorts of claims about this has always been the case, and your eyebrows go up, right? Historian brain is very active in those moments. So I certainly had a strong response to that. I know a lot of other people did. Some of what I'm going to be talking about this morning is drawn from op-ed pieces and other work that historians have written. And I'm going to focus, generally speaking, on the Dobbs case. But one could do this with some of the recent cases that have been, the rulings that have been made by the Supreme Court. So let's start with the sweeping assertion that Justice Alito made. He said that there's an unbroken tradition of prohibiting abortion on pain of criminal punishment that had persisted from the earliest days of the common law until 1973. Unbroken tradition of prohibiting abortion on pain of criminal punishment. Okay, that's a sweeping statement. That's the sort of thing, if I had it in a paper, I would immediately think to myself, unbroken, prohibiting, those are very strong words. I wonder if those are true. I wouldn't assume they're not, but they're strong statements that need to be backed up. In truth, as always, it's a cliche for me to say, actually, it's more complicated. Every historian, we can have that on our foreheads. Actually, it's more complicated. It is, but more complicated doesn't mean diffuse and full of minute details in a way that it becomes not worth thinking about. More complicated means human realities complicate the truth, right? Complicate what actually happens, so that you may have laws passed or not passed. Are they enacted? Are they followed through on? Are they enforced? That's the word I'm looking for. Are they enforced? Do people get big punishments? There are all kinds of ways to judge what happens in the past, rather than looking at a piece of evidence. Well, these laws were passed and they said this, and thus it means. So in truth, Anglo-American common law, for example, abortion was only punishable after, and some of you may have heard this in some of the coverage of this, quickening, which means the moment that the mother first feels some kind of fetal movement, which I have no direct knowledge of this, but according to my online research, is 16 to 22 weeks of gestation for a pregnancy. That's roughly when quickening happened. So first of all, generally speaking, in the common law, abortion before quickening was not seen as out of bounds, right? After quickening was the problem. So no, there isn't an unbroken tradition of prohibiting abortion. Once states began passing stricter abortion laws, roughly between the 1820s and the 1880s, apparently public sentiment didn't follow along. So few abortion providers were convicted under the new laws, again, indicating that for many Americans, this was not an all-pervasive issue in which everyone agreed that, it's bad and there should be punished with some extreme form of criminal punishment. Alito actually says that pre-quickened abortions were always strongly condemned due to laws that were passed. But indeed, over a third of the states that passed those laws kept the quickening component in there. And if they punished people for a pre-16 to 22 week pregnancy, it was much less of a punishment. It wasn't severe penalty. There were few convictions overall, and I don't have the data for this in my time working this morning. I did not have the ability to write a good research paper for you. This is based on, actually, it's partly based on what I think is a really good op-ed by Patricia Klein-Cohen, who's a women's history historian and wrote a very good op-ed either for the Washington Post or the New York Times. I can't now remember what I was reading. But anyway, that's where I'm getting some of this from. It's her yes, but it's more complicated argument. Apparently, there was a group of elite white male doctors in the late 19th century who were pushing for stricter abortion laws, using, in some cases, flawed data to get what they want. Even then, it's not as though there was evidence of widespread support to criminalize abortion. So first off, what we're saying here is it's more complicated, right? It wasn't entirely prohibited. It often, even if there was a law against it, the laws weren't necessarily enforced. punishments varied over time. Later in the 19th century is different from earlier in the 19th century. The common law does not support what the justice said. So if you're justifying the overturning of Roe on an unbroken tradition of prohibiting abortion on pain of criminal punishment, that is wrong. There is no unbroken tradition of prohibiting abortion in American history. So that is, as I said, if that person's writing a paper for my class, the words unbroken and prohibiting would be what I would want to understand for sure that this student researched. I look in the student's footnotes to see what they were citing as evidence. And I would think about things that I could think of that might contradict that and ask the student to consider them. So that's not very useful history. That's cherry picking history, or not really even thinking about history, but claiming a tradition to be used as a support for an opinion that you already have, which is precisely what I tell my students not to do, right? That you need, if you really want to talk about historical precedent, look at the history and see what the evidence says. And the evidence does not agree with what is in the Supreme Court decision. Now, so history, this is a sweeping, enormously influential and problematic to me decision, the Dobbs case, grounded on flawed and selective use of history. That's one way in which history really matters, right? In a very real, ground level, immediately in our lives way. It couldn't be more obvious in recent Supreme Court rulings that history matters, not just because it is how we understand our country, which I will come back to because it is important in that way, but it matters as a way of establishing precedent, a way of understanding law. It matters in sweeping ways, which we're being slapped in the face with now in the recent past. Now, another interesting way in which history doesn't necessarily predict what's going to happen, but certainly suggests complications to what's going on now that probably weren't considered. I am not the only person who has been looking at the situation with the overturn of Roe and thinking about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, because the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 allowed for the capture of runaway slaves, particularly to the North, and their return to slave holders in slave states. So basically, if enslaved people fled to the North, they were supposed to be captured and sent back south, according to the fugitive slave law. Penalties were supposed to be imposed on people who assisted fugitive slaves, and even federal marshals who refused to comply to the act or who let formerly enslaved people escape, there were penalties imposed on those people. Free states, some of them, refused to enforce the law and passed personal liberty laws to weaken the federal law, but of course the federal law ultimately superseded them. So what we have in this case is some states saying that slavery as it exists in their state holds true everywhere, and they have a right to impose their assumptions about what is right and wrong and their way of life on free states in the North that do not, by this point, are not slave states, right? They're free states. Slavery is not happening by this late period. It's not, as in the South, a practice that is then, what's the word I'm looking for? Underlies Northern society. It just isn't. And by 1850, you have real abolitionists. You have people who are willing to be extreme as abolitionists to really force the point. The North and Northerners feel very strongly about this because they feel that the South is imposing its will on the North. It has a personal implication for them. So the Fugitive Slave Act raises serious questions about states versus states, right? Can one state impose its laws on another state? Is that right? Can one state decide what someone formerly from their state can or can't do, or how they can or can't be in another state? Northerners basically responded to that by saying, no, they can't. But that was the question at play. And what we're now seeing, and we're now seeing discussion, right, of some states claiming that they will find ways to stop women from leaving states that have banned abortion to go to states where it's allowed, right? Which on so many levels has so much to say about one's rights as an individual and as a human being. It's rather terrifying, right? No, you can't. I mean, think of all the levels in which that's terrifying. How does someone know that you're pregnant, first off? So what invasion of privacy happens so that if you leave a state, people somehow know it's for an abortion? And what right does anyone have to decide where any of us go to do whatever it is we want to do in a legal way, right? So the Fugitive Slave Act, in many ways, and the division that it caused, and the anger that it caused, and the legal complications that it caused, and the high impact public consternation and press coverage that it got, right? It was not something that was enforced or that went smoothly. It was not something that did what the people who wanted that law wanted it to do. It created more division. It raised more problems about the union and in what shape it existed and how it was going to hold together and what was going to hold it together or drive it apart. So history has a lot to say about what something in the past, a very similar ruling about people crossing state lines and being banned from doing so, or once they've done so, being pulled back. History has at least, doesn't predict what's going to happen, but certainly offers us some pretty stern, concerning things to think about, right? It's almost hard to imagine things not evolving that way once things get put in motion and states start responding in one way or another. So just looking at the overturn of Roe, you can see on the one hand how history wasn't really accurately used to make that ruling, although the ruling claims to be based on this longstanding tradition that everybody agrees with. That doesn't exist. And then history tells us, oh, look, like decisions like this in the past are problematic on a lot of levels. And so if you're going to do this, one would think you might think about that either on a national or a state level before just sort of going with the gusto and doing what you want to do without thinking about some of the lessons that history teaches us. Now, one last, I think I'm running out of time, but not quite yet. One other example of, I'm not going to say bad history, of something that a student in my class would get a bad grade for. And this has to do with the EPA ruling, really taking back some of the power of the EPA. So the claim is, in the opinion in that ruling, is that, let's see, I have a quote here, that there is little, this is Roberts, Justice Roberts, there is little reason to think Congress assigned such decisions about some of the regulations being made now about industry emissions. There is little reason to think Congress assigned such decisions about the regulations in question to the EPA, despite the agency's belief that Congress implicitly tasked it and it alone with balancing the many vital considerations of national policy implicated in deciding how Americans will get their energy. Okay, so Justice Kagan had a lot to say about that. First, she says, and again, this is my historian brain is pleased with this. She says, some years ago, I remarked that we're all textualists now. This is in her dissent. It seems I was wrong. The current court is textualist only when being so suits it. When that method would frustrate broader goals, special canons appear as get out of text free cards. How good is that statement? I love that. And what she's referring to there is when you go back and look at the act that Congress basically created the EPA with, what it issued, what powers it gave the EPA, one of the things it said was that the EPA should choose, quote, or pick, quote, the best system of emission reduction, taking into account various factors. And Kagan writes, in selecting those words, Congress understood it had to, that the best system would change over time. Congress wanted and instructed the EPA to keep up. To ensure the statute's continued effectiveness, the best system should evolve as circumstances evolved in a way Congress knew it couldn't then know. So there's Justice Kagan saying, oh, interesting how in this case, suddenly the text doesn't matter. Because when you look at the text and you see that Congress asked the EPA to determine the best system, let me go back to this, the best system of emissions reduction, suddenly the system that is being pursued now, Congress never gave the EPA the power to make that kind of a decision. Well, it did. If you want to argue that it didn't, then you could go back and actually look and argue with the text, but that's not really what, generally speaking, what the ruling is talking about. The ruling is just, again, saying, well, this clearly wasn't assumed. Congress clearly didn't grant the power. Kagan, if nothing else, is saying, well, it's not that easy. And actually, in her opinion, clearly it did. Even if you don't agree with that, it's not clear. Like that, this is an issue that needs to be debated and can't sweepingly be imposed in, again, the way that the tone and way in which some of these Supreme Court rulings are being imposed. So let me come back here. I did like double side printing today, which may or may not have been a good idea. I don't normally do that. So, you know, I'm going to say something obvious and then touch on one last thing before I surrender my time here. Reclaiming my time, surrendering my time. You know, in one way or another, as a nation, as a people, American history is our base, right? For better and worse, it has shaped our nation and made it what it is today. You can't, national identity is shaped by it. National character is formed by it. National ambitions are carved by it. Inequities are preserved if they're ignored from the past, and are ignoring them in the past are continued into the present. You can't move towards a better future without grappling with the real past. And what we're watching is a lack of concern for the real past, and a real sort of sweeping vision of American society that certain justices are enforcing, because these, I think many of these acts add up to one vision, rulings add up to one vision. You're not necessarily seeing the close weighing of evidence, real grappling with history, debating implications. In these particular decisions, that's not what you're seeing. Now, again, thinking of history as our base in so many ways, I want to touch on one last thing, looking at the clock there, only because I noticed it in the last couple of days, and it is another way in which history matters, and that is, again, and this is something that everyone here, or certainly not everyone, but there's so many teachers here, I know, that this is not the first time you're thinking about this, but this was particularly egregious among many egregious examples of this. Apparently in Florida, there is a new civics program launched by Governor DeSantis that it's voluntary, but it's offering professional training for public K through 12 teachers. It's voluntary, but you get $3,000 of a bonus if you agree to do it. And the $3,000 comes from funding that the governor didn't spend on COVID. So by itself, that actually makes me angry. But the part of this that I actually want to raise is you can go online and steering people to Twitter. I tweeted about this maybe yesterday, late yesterday, and I included the link to the newspaper that actually has the slides or PowerPoint slides that were used in this class, this instruction, voluntary instruction as it was being taught. I just want to offer you a little taste of that. So for example, there's a slide, a PowerPoint slide that says, what, and this is exact wording, what colonial expectations made independence from England a reasonable position to hold in the 1770s? And then there's the list. self-government tradition, rule of law, robust but limited popular sovereignty, deliberative political process, and, quote, government isn't everything. What? I mean, so because the colonists assumed that government isn't everything, that made independence reasonable? First of all, I don't even know really what that means. But secondly, the first thing the colonies did in declaring independence was create new governments, right? They're even sort of within itself, self-government tradition is the first thing, justification for independence, and government isn't everything is the last. It makes no sense, but boy, that's an interesting statement that stands out from other statements that one might be able to discuss in a historical context. I don't know what that is, or really even what that means, other than it's a statement that people want to see being taught in this PowerPoint presentation. Government isn't everything. Okay, here's another slide that talks about conditions for independence. And it's on a PowerPoint titled Self-Government. And it says, self-government requires a people committed to civic and moral virtue. You know where this is going. Religion was the inculcator for virtue, period. And here's where it gets particularly blatant. There's then a discussion of the First Amendment. And they have Madison's original text of the First Amendment on a PowerPoint slide. And here's what it says. The civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any manner or on any pretext infringed. That's the draft. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The slide then says, quote, based on the language presented, does there appear to be a wall? And then it has a slide that says, misconception. The founders desired the strict separation of church and state. That's, I mean, I'm almost open-mouthed here, even just reading what I've already read. That's bad history. That's just clearly not based on a full look at the evidence, a full understanding of what was going on, other things that these same people said that flesh out these particular statements that people pulled. And that question, talk about leading. Do you really think there's a wall? Okay, that's what they might call leading the witnesses, right? And go take a look at this, because that's not all there is that's concerning, but that in Florida is being offered to public K through 12 teachers as training for teaching American history. I want to conclude, because I know I'm going over, I want to conclude with something that Twitter, every time I mention Twitter, some part of me goes cringe, it's like, how are you a historian, a serious historian doing this? But I say what I always say, it's a remarkably effective teaching tool. I want to read the pinned quote that I have on my Twitter page, my profile. I wrote it a while back, but it relates to what I'm talking about today, and it relates to how we think about and understand and deploy history, American history, as a people, as a nation, as citizens, and how that can help or hurt us. So I'm just going to read this and then I'll stop and open things up for questions. Learning history involves evaluating documents from the past, seriously considering conflicting ideas, drawing conclusions based on reliable evidence, debating ideas with others, and owning the bad as well as the good in a nation's past. It requires an open mind. It involves wrestling with the uncomfortable as well as uncovering the admirable. The only way to truly know and love a nation is to embrace it in all its complexity, including its sins as well as its virtues, and work for a better future. The story of history, the sincere, open, and serious study of history in all its complexity, is dangerous and misleading only if you have something to hide. And it's impossible to understand ourselves as a nation and to reckon with the roots and implications of our current moment if we deny the uncomfortable parts of America's past. I felt that very strongly whenever I wrote it, probably a year or two ago at least. And I feel it very strongly now. And I feel the need for us to have a conversation about history in this current moment, to talk about what you, as those of you who are history teachers, how you're reflecting on this, and just to really have an open discussion about this issue and what it suggests, because history matters in many, many ways. And right now, legally, it matters a lot. Okay, mug. I knew. Let me do this. Mug. Okay, this. So I will say before I show the mug, and if there's anyone here who has not been here before, every week for 117 weeks, I have a mug that relates to the topic that I address. I do not have 117 mugs, so they have been used over and over again, and I've been creative, but it has happened. One of you out there gave me this mug. I did not purchase this mug for myself, and as ever, I am not good at remembering who did it. So here's the mug I chose. History should make you uncomfortable. History should make you uncomfortable. It should make you question things. It should make you wonder things. It should make you feel uncomfortable about things that you've taken for granted. That's called thinking and growing and learning. So that is the very thematically appropriate mug for today's discussion. So do we know who gave me that mug? Someone will have to say, if they're out there watching, someone gave me that mug and I thank them for it. Okay, let us open things up for questions. Someone can check the mug on the spreadsheet, because yes, there is a mug spreadsheet, which I've never looked at. It might be Tom, as a matter of fact. I think it might be Tom, now that you've said that. Okay, let us open things up for questions and have a discussion, as we do every week.
Yep, and I'm a little, my connection had you freezing a little, so somebody let me know in the chat if you can hear me clear enough to do the Q&A. Okay, so we have a lot of questions as always. Can you guys hear me clear enough?
I can hear you.
Yes. Okay, so Ellen posed the first question right out of the gate. You barely had started talking, Joanne. She had this really, really big question. She said she's been thinking about the legal abortion argument for victims of rape and incest based on the 8th Amendment under the cruel and unusual punishment. Her question is, if a girl or woman suffered a pregnancy because of a crime, and then the state forces her to have a baby, couldn't that be considered cruel and unusual punishment? She's wondering what your thoughts are on that from a historian's point of view.
Well, that almost is not a historian point of view, but a legal point of view. You know, I would say as a historian, it appears to me that there are many ways in which, like that one, which is a good example, in which people could now step forward and question the precise wording of the ruling, right? As people who made the ruling might have looked at the precision in the past. It appears to me that there are many ways, legally speaking, in which one might question this ruling, in many ways, in part maybe on a personal level, in part on a state level or a level of federalism in one way or another. So I personally can't say, I mean, I would say yes, that appears to me to be cruel and unusual punishment, but I say that without the legal knowledge to talk about the ways in which that might be more complicated than I'm claiming. So my hesitant historian answer is, sure seems that way. But what we now need to see, and what people now need to do, is to ask a lot of questions and push a lot of questions and push back on this ruling in various ways to see what it really means and in what ways has it not anticipated some pretty obvious legal constitutional ways of addressing it.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, Mary Beth is asking, what is one thing you found researching history that just completely came out of left field, surprised you in maybe a primary source, or just what was your biggest, like, whoa, didn't see that one coming moment as a historian?
Biggest. Well, I mean, I remember having a major one in my first book, actually, even before it was a book. So Affairs of Honor, which is on the logic, the grammar of political combat in the 1790s. I went into that project knowing that I was interested in the sort of cultural logic of national politics. And my master's thesis, so before it was a book, before it was a dissertation, I thought, I see a lot of gossip being tossed around, or people talking about gossip in letters to each other. And so I thought, well, I'm going to make my master's thesis about the use of political gossip by politicians and what we can tell about it. Which, for those of you who know that book, I believe that's chapter 2 of the book, chapter 2 of my dissertation. So I went to the Library of Congress and I began to do research, looking in people's letters, sort of finding moments in which I thought there might be gossip. I spent at least a couple of days there being really sweeping. I tend to not have lunch, not go to the bathroom when I'm doing research. I was there for many, many, many hours. And at a certain point, I thought, well, my career as a historian is now over because I'm not finding actual gossip. I see no gossip. I can't find the gossip. I thought it would be there. How could it not be there? People talk about gossip all the time, and I can't find any. I won't even have a master's thesis. And then I stopped and thought, wait a minute, Freeman. Everyone's talking about it, but no one's writing it down. What does that mean? And ultimately, the sort of, that I realized was, it's so important, it's so damaging that no one wanted to write the gossip down. They just, in my book, I call it the ouch factor. They wrote down things like, you can't say that. How could he say that? I thought I literally had failed. Went in with a question and that question was not answered. And then suddenly I thought, oh my gosh, this is everywhere. And it's actually a big part of the politics, the culture of the politics. That's kind of huge. A short version of a similar one in that book is the last chapter about the election of 1800. I wanted to understand the logic of that election, the cultural logic of that election. Spend another couple of days at the library, research, going back home after my last day of research. And I think, what did I see in those last few days? What did I actually see? I don't know what I saw. Like, I didn't see discussion of like policy. I didn't see discussion of ideology. What did I see? And then I thought, hey, wait a minute. I didn't see discussion of policy or ideology in this major election. That's not what I saw. I saw on a very personal level, people talking about what the election boiled down to, as well as far as sort of, I don't want to call it an ideology. It was on a personal level, my team against your team, but I don't predict your team and I can't predict my team. It was a totally different way of understanding that election. It wasn't two structured parties with two obvious structured views. Certainly the Federalists and the Republicans were very different in their ideas, but that election didn't unfold the way I thought it would. And that dramatically changed the way I understood the election, and those sorts of things dramatically changed the way that I understood how politics worked in this period, led me to say things that I still commit to, that there was no first party system because there wasn't a system and they weren't parties. All of that was something that came from surprises. I did not go into my dissertation thinking I shall now disprove the first party system idea. So anyway, that's small examples, but in both cases, I was like, it's one of those wonderful moments where I was like, oh, what I think I didn't see, actually what I saw is important. So those are always possible if you have an open mind and actually want to understand the past as opposed to impose your view on the past.
Yep. So there's a lot of love in the chat. I think there's going to be a wait a minute Freeman mug out there in the future. People seem to
Okay.
enjoy that phrase. There's also been a lot of discussion both in the chat and over here in the Q&A. People are wondering, they said it seems like with all the Supreme Court decisions have been like one after another, we've kind of been hit with hard this past week. The one, I believe is they're referencing the Oklahoma case with the tribal land rights decision that came down earlier this week. Miranda and Cece both commented on that one, so I'm combining those two questions. They're just wondering, like, this one seems to have slipped through the crack or not been on the media's radar quite as much. They're wondering why. I, of course, have my own thoughts about that, but they want to know your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I don't necessarily have strong thoughts other than to say, on the one hand, guns, religion, abortion, Miranda, climate, right? These are, first of all, for many people, front and center things that also add up to a sweeping direction of change that seems clear. I think people don't think about this other ruling as being as significant, right? Which says something in and of itself that that's not how the press has reacted. That's not how people have reacted. In some ways, I would assume people are just assuming, well, that doesn't have a big impact on me, and so I'm not going to be as focused on it. I'm more focused on these other rulings. You know, I actually did not do any poking around. I didn't look up more details about the Miranda. I didn't look up more details about the gun ruling, and I didn't look up more details on this one. But the simple fact that you're asking that question and that it totally poof is under the radar is really interesting. And there's one of those moments, just like I just said, where the absence of something is very interesting and needs to be investigated. Why is it not there? And what does that mean? A different way of using historical evidence, a really important one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Cece had a little bit added to her question. She had also included the one about the indigenous ruling. It says, if this could, would Joanne agree that the ignorance or misuse of history by the current Supreme Court majority is showing in part that they are delegitimizing themselves, or at a minimum showing they are completely politicized and have no interest in history?
Well, no interest in history, I would say they sure demonstrated that. You know, I would say, you know, you can look back over time and you can say, it's not as though there was a golden moment where there was nothing political about the Supreme Court, right? The justices are put in power by presidents who have certain politics, and they put people into the Supreme Court who agree with their politics generally. That said, what we have now is a crew of justices who are forwarding a vision based on their desire to forward a vision of the United States, not grounded in tradition, not grounded in precedent, not grounded in a judgment about the common good in any way, right? Just making rulings based on the fact that they have power and they can make them. And these are all clearly rulings that people who agree with them have wanted for a really long time. So, you know, it's not as though I can say for the first time the court is politicized, but you know, I've seen a number of people call it a rogue court, and I think that's true. They are in some ways legislating because they have power and they know that they have it and they know that they can't be held accountable for it. And so these rulings, or at least many of them, aren't individual rulings grounded on issues that need to be considered in and of themselves. They are together in some kind of a more sweeping assertion on the part of these justices. That's dangerous. That's just dangerous. So yeah, in some ways the court is, the credibility of the court is being damaged at a time when a lot of national institutions already have been damaged. So this is something that many people, including me, talked about way back, actually during the Trump presidency, that in one way or another, he was eroding national institutions throughout his presidency. You know, this doesn't matter. This isn't any good. Whatever. Why do we believe them? You know, the elections the electoral process being just the most obvious example of many. So we are at a moment when national institutions are no longer, to many people of many different forms of politics, seem trustworthy. That's dangerous. If people are concerned about the credibility of elections, there are legal and constitutional ways to investigate that, but the fact that we can no longer necessarily assume that there are free and fair elections, and that we're sort of seemingly watching a process go into play that will prevent free and fair elections from happening, that's problematic. And I think, you know, people who don't believe that the court has any credibility, it's an interesting thing, because the justices in its way are above the public. They're supposed to be, right? So they're supposed to be the branch that it doesn't get a direct impact of the American populace. They're supposed to be above us, sort of thinking more generally about the common good, governing, ruling on things that Congress in some cases thinks it should be ruling on. So, you know, I would say, yeah, the court is hurting its credibility. I think it's as bad as many of the other national institutions that are being eroded in some way. In this case, the court appears to be somewhat doing it to itself. The problem is, and I'm going to use someone, if they don't have bingo already, will get it. But the problem is that in the contingency of this moment, I can't make a pronouncement about what that sort of lack of credit, what that discrediting process means. I don't think it's good. I think it's good for Americans to be aware and alert and awake and questioning everything that's happening right now, and reading things closely and thinking about the implications. So I do think it's good that people are looking at what's happening and evaluating what's happening and being alarmed by what's happening, or maybe you're loving what's happening, but in one way or another, it's important to note, to observe, to think about what's happening. But a court that doesn't seem credible in some way, I don't know what that means. And I can't make predictions about adding justices to the court. I can't make predictions about the filibuster. Things are in such an unstable state now, particularly with the ruling that's going to come down the road about the role of state legislatures in the electoral process. I'm not even going to go there, but that could be the end of democracy right there. But we are in such a moment of such extreme contingency where things are happening that aren't necessarily entirely surprising, but they're actually happening, and they're happening together. And it's hard to judge what will actually happen. We can talk about implications. It's hard to make predictions. And I just think as historically speaking, what that means is that we need to be in this moment. We need to be alert to what's happening in this moment, and we need to be acting in this moment, questioning things like where we started with, can we make a legal case about cruel and unusual punishment? Maybe we can, right? This is a moment to push on that. This is a moment to be more aggressive than saying just vote. Now, that said, I am going to say, boy, this election coming up, you might not even want to follow me on Twitter after a point, because I'm going to be talking about the importance of this vote in every way I can talk about. And I already see people saying, well, the Democrats haven't done anything, so why should I vote for them? Which is, you might as well shoot yourself in the foot if you don't like what's going on now. We either have an equal or ideally greater presence in Congress, or we kind of begin to surrender the game. So I went way off track of the original question, which I have now already forgotten. What was the original question?
I'm not sure that I remember it, because I've already sent it to the answered column.
Okay,
So
okay. Whatever it is, I answered
good.
it in there. I answered it.
You did.
And then got distracted, because there's so much to talk about, truly.
We do. And same thing. So Jennifer had put a question in the Q&A, but I actually kicked it over to the chat. She was asking, she's nervous because you had said, are there any teachers here? We have lots more teachers in the summer, as you know, than we do during the school year because some of them are teaching when we're together on Friday mornings. So a lot of teachers rely on the video, right? They watch it over the weekend and use it the next week in their class. But Jennifer's teaching a new course starting with Reconstruction. That's where her course next year will, and so she's just nervous about the whole CRT, divisive concepts laws. So I actually kicked that over the chat because we have a lot of great veteran teachers here that I think will have a lot of advice for her, Joanne. But if you have anything you want to say about what do teachers do with all these divisive concepts laws, I think we've had this question a few times and you've answered it a few times on screen. So I feel like we have some of that in the archives. So if it's okay with you, I kick that out to the Carolees and the Clooneys and the other teachers in the group. But I didn't want to not give you a chance to answer if you want to field that, or if you want to pass that off to the Carolee Brigade and let them surround them with love, take care of them.
I mean, I think the master teachers here are going to have more to say on it. I will repeat something that I've said in the past, which is primary sources can be very effective here. Because primary sources, you offer them to a class and you read them and you evaluate them, and you're not assigning a book with an opinion. You don't even necessarily have to be very opinionated in the presentation. You have the students do just what I've been talking about here, which is read carefully, think about the meaning of words, debate with each other what they think the words mean, talk about the different things that a document can mean. And already, if you are teaching, even if it, if that's slavery or race or anything, if you are making students aware of the fact that there isn't one view and that you can think along the lines of what many of us here would consider to be good history, that's not the entire battle, but that's part of the battle. And I mention that only because my, even when I'm doing public events or lectures of any kind, my ultimate source, if I really feel like I've given lots of logic and people aren't buying it, I'll pull out a primary source. And I've said this already before, that somehow or other, my brain remembers correspondence from the 1790s and now a little bit into the 19th century. So I can actually say, as so-and-so wrote in 1792. And primary evidence, that's has power, particularly when you're using it effectively and realistically and accurately. That allows you to say things without saying them. If you're truly teaching them and opening things for debate in a way that these, what do I want to call it? Coming down hard on what people are now calling critical race theory, which has nothing to do with what critical race theory is now. That's just a code for race and slavery at this point. But still, primary sources give you room for a broader discussion. That's a little tiny answer to a really big question. So actually, I'm saving the chat because I'm going to want to see what others are saying too, who have been in a classroom situation of a sort that I haven't yet.
Yeah. And that reminds me, Joanne, you had started doing kind of a series. I think you did 2 of the W's, I think you called them. You were going to kind of do and I don't think we ever finished that. And a couple of teachers said, I hope Joanne goes back and finishes that because they wanted to use them in their class.
Oh,
so
okay.
Think about when you're picking your topics, maybe go back through the archive. I think you did a couple of them and you mentioned you were going to try and do all of them at one point.
I think it was over the holidays. I think I pre-recorded like a who, what, where, or something like that.
Yeah.
I could go back.
Request to expand on that, because teachers really love using that. Okay, that was just my little pitch.
Yeah,
there,
no, that's good to know.
A couple of teachers have put that in the chat a few weeks ago. Okay, so here's an interesting one from Doug. It says, did the theories of Thomas Malthus, who wrote about around the time of the founding, have influence on attitudes about abortion as it related to population control?
Wow. Well, it had an influence on ideas about population and demographics and expansion west, right? So it was certainly present in the minds of, politically minded and other minded folk in that generation. I don't know. I honestly just don't know if either in some way it was applied to the question of abortion or not. If it was, it would have been in a very facts and figures kind of a way, because Malthus is talking about demographics and population and the impact of a big population. And, Jefferson was very interested in Malthus and he for him, that was helpful in explaining why it was so important to push west and why the Louisiana Purchase made sense. So it's something that certainly he, among many other people, thought about. But I have no idea how at the time, or if at the time, it was related to the question of abortion. It's a really good question. I haven't thought about Malthus for a really, really, really long time. And I probably didn't ask this question of it forever.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Doug, for that question. Okay, this one comes from Keith asking, does the 250th anniversary that's coming up of the Revolutionary War affect the culture wars? Like, how do you think that's going to play in, as if we need one more thing to stir that up?
Well, so I will, of course it will in some ways, right? Because that gets back to where I started, about history shaping national identity, national character, national politics, national ambitions, our sense of who we are as citizens. Who the heck knows where we're going to be in a couple of years? But yeah, I think that that's going to be enormously important. I think it'll get in one way or another yanked into what we can now call the culture wars. But I think whether it is or isn't, it's going to be enormously important. And already I get a sense that there's stuff happening, plans being made without necessarily consulting a lot of historians. So I hear some historian grumbling going on. That would certainly not make this the first time that there was a massive national celebration that was about celebrating and capitalism more than about history. Now, this is a moment when it would really behoove us to use that moment to teach some good history, to raise the idea of questioning the past, to point out the fact that our bicentennial is significant for many reasons, and it celebrates some of the achievements that this nation has made at the time, and that those achievements in the context of the time were problematic in many ways. So we can celebrate a bicentennial by really looking at what that period was all about, and even more important, celebrating the ways in which populations not included in that moment use that language and use that logic to push their way into what they deserved. There are all kinds of ways in which we can think about what we say during this upcoming 250th moment, but I think this is going to be a really important moment in how we think about our history and how we can use that moment to get people to ask questions and think in a more open-minded way than perhaps they are already.
And I think I read something in the Washington Post this week that there was a national committee formed, I think a couple of years ago, to kind of guide the 250th anniversary stuff. And then apparently it was supposed to be bipartisan, but it's had a lot of infighting, and they're not making any progress because they can't seem to get along. So that might be something Tim, or one of our great, people who like to throw things in the chat really quickly, might want to find that WAPO article about that. They can't even agree on their own celebration.
Well, right. I mean, these are these kinds of celebrations are always heavily charged, precisely because they are sort of, moments of national identity forging in a extreme, really obvious kind of a way that, in that moment may have a big impact. I mean, the degree to which the bicentennial continues to have an influence today would be an interesting conversation. I have a former graduate student who does all kinds of interesting work on how the memory of the revolution was used in the bicentennial and continues to be used. But at any rate, I see we've gone over time. I will say this was an excellent discussion. And I realize, I will say here at the end, that I normally try to not be super political in my comments. I totally acknowledge and accept the fact that some of you don't agree with me, and I'm not, I would never, I don't call people names for disagreeing with me. I don't, if you go on Twitter, you will see I never call people who disagree with me stupid. I may really strongly disagree with what they say, but that moment of disagreement can be used to foster a useful conversation rather than used as a moment to pile on with insults. So I hope that people who are here who might not agree with me, at least as people who are interested in history, since history matters, can see this discussion as a way of talking about the serious consideration of how we are using history as a nation right now. I will now say, well, first of all, next week, I guess, in a moment, I'll let you, Annie, sort of explain what's happening next week. But next week also might be your last week for a while, right?
I know that the following week, I'm helping NCHE, who sponsors History Matters. I'll be back at Monticello taking teachers there for them.
Okay.
So I think the bus arrives at 9:30. So I know that Friday afterwards, I'm kind of the field trip leader there.
Okay.
So we'll have to figure something out. But
Okay.
after that, you and I can maybe chat offline and figure the rest out.
Oh, okay. Then that's good. I just didn't want, if it were, I didn't want the moment to pass.
Oh, no, I hope not. No, I
Oh,
hope
good.
I want to make, but I want to honor that other commitment unless NCHE
Oh, no,
wants
for
to find
sure.
someone else to do that and have me here wherever they need me the most.
For sure.
Okay, so next Friday we are having a meetup. I put a link to a Google Doc where I think I have all the names of people who have definitely said yes. If you still think you can make it to Monticello in person next Friday, we will do what we've just been doing here. We'll just be doing it live from Monticello, and then we'll have a nice lunch, and then we'll go up to the mountain and have a house and tour of the grounds and all that good stuff. So we would love to have as many members of this community join us as are able.
Real life meeting.
Real life meeting. We have about a dozen of us so
I wish I
far.
could be there, but I love it.
I wish you could too. I think there's about a dozen of us on the list. So if your name is on the list and it shouldn't be, let me know for sure. But if it's not on the list and you want to come, there's still a few slots open. I just need to know by Tuesday because the security people like to have the list so they know who's on the property when it's a big group. So I want to be respectful of their, wanting to keep us all safe. Okay, so we didn't get to all the questions. We never get to all the questions, but there is an after party. So maybe we can throw a couple in at the after party. But this is the part where
I was going right there in case, because there are more people here than there have been in the recent past, which is excellent.
Facebook has to switch, right? Facebook has to log in through Zoom.
Well, exactly. That's what I was about to say, is that for those who haven't been here before, now we segue to the after party. If you have beamed in through the NCHE link, just stay where you are and someone's going to get bingo, poof, you will be in the after party. All that means is that we will no longer be recording, so we can have a somewhat freer conversation that can wander more widely if we choose to have it. If you are beaming in through Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and join us through ncheteach.org/conversations, and then you will be instantly in the after party as well. I will also say what I always say, which is thank you for engaging in democracy on a Friday morning, particularly this week when it's going to be important for us to engage in democracy in many, many ways for a while, for an extended while. So I'm happy to be part of this community in doing it. We will be here next week with an in real life meetup of people, which again, I just kind of love. Exactly, I love it. And so I guess we can segue. Okay, I see people saying we should talk. Okay, I don't know what's going on there because I can't read. But at any rate, thank you for being here because it matters. It really matters. I know to some of you at least, certainly to me, but in the broader context of things, boy, do we need to be awake, alert, and discussing what's going on right now. Okay, I will shut up so that we can go to the after party because we went long, I realize. Okay.
So I don't know if Kathleen needs to turn the recording off. Hopefully
Yes,
Kathleen
I'm
is
doing that right now. All right, thank you. Hold on.
Thanks, Kathleen.